Algebra and formula substitution. Formulas are used for many different situations. Some of these include circumference, area, volume, amounts of investments, interest, and distances. Essentially, you've done a version of formula substitution even in our last unit when we looked at perimeter of certain shapes. So this shouldn't seem too confusing for you today. But we're going to take a look at some examples of how we can use formula substitution in some real life examples. So number 1 says the formula for the perimeter of a rectangle is P equals 2 times L plus W, where P is the perimeter, L is the length, and W is the width. We're going to calculate the perimeter of the rectangle with a length of 22 centimeters and a width of 14 centimeters. You could draw the diagram of the rectangle if you want to, although that's not necessary in this question. So we're going to start by writing out our formula that's given to us. P equals 2 times length plus W. Now we're going to substitute in our values for the unknowns. So instead of length, we're going to enter in 22. That comes right from our question, the length of 22 centimeters. And we're going to enter in 14 for our W. That's the width of 14 centimeters. Using BEDMAS tells us that we need to solve for what's inside of the bracket first. So 22 plus 14 gives us 36. And now we can do multiplication. So 2 times 36 gives us 72. Because we're dealing with a question that involves perimeter, we need to use our units. Our units in our question are centimeters. Remember that perimeter is not squared, so it's just 72 centimeters. And because this is a word problem, we can use a therefore statement. So therefore, the perimeter of the rectangle is 72 centimeters. The next example, example number 2, has a question that involves interest. So interest is something that you will learn a lot about, especially in your grade 11 class and a little bit in grade 10. But we're going to take a look at just how we can use this simple formula to calculate interest that is earned, whether that's an investment or even in a savings account. So the formula for calculating the final amount an investment earning simple interest is given by the formula A equals P times 1 plus RT, where A is the final amount of the investment, P is the initial amount invested, R is the interest rate written in decimal form, and T is the time in years for the investment. Calculate the amount an investment of $2,500 would be worth after 12 years if the investment earned interest at a rate of 5% of simple interest. Now that's a lot of wording in this question, but not to be too alarmed. So we want to look at what's important in this question. Well, the formula itself is important. We need to think about what our A is and our P is. So we're calculating our A. So our initial investment is $2,500. We want to think about how long we're investing for. So that's our 12 years. And what the interest rate is, so 5%. So we have all of this information now that we can use to calculate our final amount of our investment. So it tells us that the interest rate needs to be written in decimal form. So if we think back to when we looked in Unit 1, when we converted between decimals and percents and fractions, we learned that to convert a percentage into a decimal number, we need to divide by 100. And that gives us a value of 0.05. So when we're putting it into the formula, we have to put it into decimal form. So now we're going to use our formula that's given to us. So A equals P times 1 plus R times T. And inside of our formula, we're going to now substitute in the values that we know. So our P is our 2,500. 1 plus our R is 0.05. And we're multiplying this by our T, and our T is the amount of years, which is 12. So the next thing we want to do is we want to solve what's inside of our brackets, but we have to do that using BEDMAS. So we have to calculate our multiplication section of our bracket first before we can do any addition. So when we're calculating our formula, we put our 2,500 out front times 1, and now we have to multiply our 0.05 by our 12. That gives us a value of 0.6. So inside of my bracket, I have 1 plus 0.6. Now I can add what's inside of my brackets. So inside of my bracket is 1.6. And the final step that you want to do is to multiply your 2,500 by your 1.6. And that gives us an answer of 4,000. Now you have to think about your units. This is a question that involves money, so we need to include our dollar sign in front of our 4,000. And every good word problem needs a therefore statement. Therefore, the investment is worth $4,000 after 12 years. The next example that we're going to look at is volume. Now, we're not going to look at volume in too much detail until our next unit, but we can use the substitution and the formula to help us with this lesson today. So the formula for the volume of a cylinder is V equals pi r squared h, where V is the volume of the cylinder, r is the radius, and h is the height. We looked at radius when we looked at circles in area and in perimeter. And so now we're going to think about using the radius in terms of the formula for volume. So we are going to calculate the volume of the cylinder, and that's given to us in our question. So the volume equals pi times r squared times h. Now remember from before when we looked at circles, pi is 3.14. So you can use that value or you can use your pi button on your calculator, knowing that the pi button on your calculator will use more decimal places than just 0.14. Our radius is given to us in the question. So it says to calculate the volume of a cylinder with a radius of 4. So I'm going to enter in 4, making sure that I need to square that. And the height of 6. So the height is 6 there. So I'm going to place that in or substitute that in for the letter H. So we're going to calculate this to the nearest tenth. And if you remember, when we calculate values to the nearest tenth, that's 1 decimal place. So our final answer, we need to round to 1 decimal place. So BEDMAS tells us we need to do brackets first and then exponents. So we don't have any calculations inside of a bracket to do, but we do have our exponents. So we have to do 4 squared first, and 4 squared is 16. And now we can do our multiplication. So after exponents is division. We don't have any division in this question, but we do have multiplication. And you can multiply all 3 of these numbers together using your calculator in one step. So I'm going to take 3.14, I'm going to times it by 16, and then I'm going to times that by 6. And when I do that, I get a value of 301.44, or 301 and 44 hundredths. But I only want to the nearest tenth. So I need to think about my 4. The first 4 is in the 10th position. The number beside the 4 is a 4. So because that is less than 5, then I keep my 4 as a 4 and I don't round up. So my final value to 1 decimal place is 301 and 4 tenths. And I want to include my units. So it tells us, actually doesn't tell us our units. So we don't know whether this is being measured in centimeters or meters. So we can just put 301.4 and then we can write the word unit. And because it's volume, it's squared, or cubed, sorry. It's cubed. So if you wanted to put this as a meter or a centimeter instead of writing the word unit, you can do that as well. And if I don't give you the units, you can also just keep it as 301.4 as your answer and then leave out this part right here. That's fine as well. Okay, so the next part of this question tells us we want to calculate the volume of a cylinder with a radius of 8 and a height of 6 to the nearest tenth. So we're going to use the same formula, but we're going to substitute in different values for radius and height. So just to give us another practice working out this question. So we're going to start by writing in our formula that's given to us. So this is our volume of a cylinder. And then we're going to substitute in the numbers or the values for our letters or our variables. So I have 3.14. My radius in this question is 8, so 8 squared, and my height is 6. Have to do my exponent first. So 3.14 times 64, 8 squared is 64, 8 times 8 times 6. And again, you can calculate this in one step using your calculator. 3.14 times 64 times 6. And that gives us an answer of 1,205.76 or 76 hundredths. Now, I want to, again, put this into the nearest tenth. So I only want 1 decimal place. So I look at the digit that's in my 10th position, that's a 7. The number beside that is a 6. 6 is greater than 5, so I have to round this 7 up to an 8. So the volume is 1,205 and 8 tenths. This would be cubed because we're dealing with volume, and volume we deal with three-dimensional objects. So think about three-dimensional objects would be cubed. Okay. So now we're going to take the information that we found in part A and part B, and we're going to try to answer this question. So in part A, we had a radius of 4. In part B, we doubled that radius to have a radius of 8. If the radius of a cylinder is doubled, is the volume of the cylinder doubled? So let's take a look at those values. So in part A, our volume was 301 and 4 tenths. In part B, our volume was 1,205 and 8 tenths. In part A, our radius was 4. In part B, our radius was 8. So we doubled or multiplied our radius by 2. But if I was to multiply my 301.4 by 2, I would get an answer that is smaller than 1,200. So is the radius of my cylinder doubled? Is the volume of the cylinder doubled? The answer to that would be no. So I would say no, because 301.4 times 2 is less than 1,205 and 8 tenths.